everybody. It's me, Sean Bischoff, General Manager for Triumph, and this is episode 8 of Together. Before we get into today's show, I want to give a shout out to something really cool that we announced last week, actually, so I'm a little bit late. Apologize. We did announce our new merchandise line with Champion. We have jerseys, we have a hoodie. It's a pretty cool line, actually. I'm really, really excited. It was a big deal for us to announce. Take a second today, after this episode, maybe during this episode, head on over to wearenations.com. You can go to the different teams section. You can click on the Triumph logo to find our collection. This is going to be our new pro jersey for 2021. We just launched it, and the pre-sale is actually still live for a few days. It ends on the 26th of December. Of course, this episode, when this episode comes out, you're only going to have a few days left to get the pre-sale. So make sure to get in there, support us with the new jersey. It's the one you're going to see everybody rocking on the big stage when we go to the major at the end of the year. Today's guest is a friend of mine. It's actually sort of like an internal guest, so I'm glad to have him on. His name is Marcos. He is otherwise known as Tacitus FPS. He is the head coach for our CSGO team. He is a brilliant mind and maybe the most well-spoken person I've ever met in the Counter-Strike scene, and I'm happy to have him on. So without further ado, let's get into the show. Marcos, what's up, brother? How are you?
Hey, what's up? First of all, thanks for the introduction. You might have overrated me slightly, but I do appreciate all the compliments. And yeah, Sean and I have been working together for, I think, roughly the past 6 months on trying to build the best possible version of a Triumph roster. We've hit some bumps in the roads when it comes to players being sold to, bigger teams like Grim to Liquid. And we've lost, players like Curry to college. But I think we've had a really good dynamic in trying to rebuild these rosters over time. And I hope that we have a strong start to next year.
And there you go, folks. That's the interview. That's no, Marcos, listen, man, you got to get used to people complimenting you because you're going to be getting it a lot, I think. I know it's still awkward for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's just human nature, right? People are just never, I don't know, I guess we're never too used to hearing ourselves being talked up.
Yeah, 100%. No, I feel weird too when people, if anyone ever compliments me, I just shut down. I can't. But yeah, man, no, you've had a pretty interesting year, and I wanted to have you on because we're sort of nearing the end of 2020, of course, and it's holiday season. It's player break for a lot of CS teams in general. So I think it's a good time to reflect sort of on the last year, not only for yourself, I suppose, because you've made a lot of transitions and a lot of progress this year. From being a player to an analyst to a head coach, but also just, reflecting on the CS scene, reflecting on Triumph. I think there's a lot to cover. So I just figured it'd be good to have you on. So thanks for joining.
Well, thanks for the invite. Yeah, definitely a lot to look back on. As you said, it was kind of a crazy year for me. I started with one role, which was playing in the tier 2, tier 3 NA scene, then moved on to an analyst in Triumph, and then moved on to a coach within Triumph. And just kind of looking back at the spectrum at the level of Counter-Strike that I was involved in back in January and the level of Counter-Strike that I've been involved in now in November, December, it's just kind of like night and day. So it's been a crazy year, and I'm glad that it happened.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's an interesting path that you take, so how are you liking where you're at now? Like, so when you made the decision to go from being a player to focusing more on being an analyst, what made you make that decision? What kind of led you to lean into coaching rather than playing?
I think when I used to play, it was always a thought in the back of my mind that, eventually when my career was over, I was going to transition into some sort of manager, staff, coach role. I didn't know which. And I think earlier this year, it kind of struck me that I no longer enjoyed playing as much as I did prior. I think if you're trying to go professional in any sort of esport, you have to not only like the competitive drive of it, you have to enjoy, playing the game enough so that you can do it 8, 9, 10, 12 hours a day. And that just wasn't for me anymore. So I kind of looked at where my biggest qualities laid within my game, and it was definitely the tactical aspect. So it was very obvious to me that I needed to move on to some sort of analytical or coaching role. At first, I went to the analyst choice, which was more clear to me because it was just involving the in-game strategies, tactics, and whatnot. The coaching role still involved some, dealing with player emotions, having to deal with some, I don't know, I guess fixing team conflict and working with actual like the humane level aspect of teams. So I didn't know if I was ready for that dynamic, but I think as time moved on and as I got more intimate with the players and we started to build a relationship, I definitely had enough comfort built up to where I was ready to make that transition happen. And I don't think I could be any happier of where I am right now. I think with esports, we are very guilty of sometimes not valuing how much progress we make over time. And I think to have made the progress I made within a year might seem like a long time in esports, but in the grand scheme of things of life, I don't think it's any time at all. And I think it kind of still just hasn't struck me like that I'm, getting to compete against the teams that I was merely just studying demos of for my previous teams when I used to play.
Yeah. No, it's beautiful. It's crazy how much can happen in a year, right? Could you even imagine this time last year, last December, that you'd be in the position you're in now?
No way. I mean, if I thought about it, it would be like, I'd be hopeful to be in the position that I'm in right now. It wouldn't be a realistic expectation that I'd set out for myself.
Yeah. And of course, there's a lot to be done still. There's still like a lot of work to be done. It's not like you're living in I don't know exactly where you're living, but it's not like you're living in a mansion or anything necessarily. So.
Oh no, yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm ready to get out there and win and just buy a Bugatti and a few mentions.
Yeah, maybe when MIBR gives you a call, you hang up the phone from MIBR, you immediately just call the local Bugatti dealer, just let them know you're on the way.
Oh yeah, if I get that call, I just tweet out thanks for 1 million followers, just buy 2 mansions over in the LA coast. Oh yeah, we're cruising.
Yes, sir. Yeah, no, it's cool. It's been great to work with you too. When you first joined the team, you and I joined the team honestly about the same time. Of course, you were more familiar with the players than I was because you knew like Alan and Gabe for a long time, right? So when I came on as GM, it was the same time we were onboarding as analysts, and like immediately it was obvious to me that analyst wasn't going to be where you were going to make your biggest impact necessarily. Now, you are a good analyst, of course, and I think the bulk of your work is still more on the analytical side and more on the strategical side. But I think it's really hard to find people that have good interpersonal skills in the esports scene. So, from my perspective, I think you've done a great job this year, man. And as I've said to you before, it's nonstop growth, man. You just have to keep learning. You have to keep getting better. And I think in the position you're in now, it's like the best place to be to continue to learn and improve. So.
I mean, I do remember that you were indeed the first person that messaged me within the org or whatever to say, hey, I think you could be a great fit for the coaching role. And if I recall correctly, the first time around, I was like, well, I'm a little skeptical about transitioning right now. I don't know how comfortable I would be. And then I think a month passed on and you were like, well, just sleep on the decision. Just think about it. You have time. It's not like we're rushing a decision like this. And I think the turning point of the year was around Blast or Summit, when we had, extensive series and we played a bunch of top teams. And I think our Summit run ended with the MIBR BO3. And at that point, I was like, okay, I've been in the server enough with the guys. I've been dealing with, mid-game issues, trying to bring people back for maybe a rough start, a rough performance. I've had to talk to these players on a daily basis. And I was like, why not just kind of take the leap and at least end out the year as a coach, kind of give this like a 6-month shot. And I think that 6 months is kind of coming to a close. And I don't think I could be any happier that I made this transition. And I mean, I'm just, again, looking forward to 2021 and see what we can do with it.
Yeah. Well, you're a natural, dude. I mean, it's not like, it's pretty obvious that this is kind of the role that you might be best in. Or at the very least, being an analyst role, you're not really utilizing your skills to their fullest, which maybe is more important. And yeah, I don't know, there's also another problem where, the reason why I waited for you basically was because the other coaches that I talked to in the scene really are not very developed, we could talk for endlessly and we'll probably talk about it a little bit. This might actually be a good segue, to be honest, about the scene in North America and how it's kind of struggling to develop new professionals, whether you're talking about players or coaches, leadership. Because when you joined as an analyst, I immediately started looking at head coaches to join alongside you, right? And it's difficult because the team was already kind of built. So normally when you want to work with a head coach long term, you want them to kind of build the team that they want. And so since our team was already built, it's difficult to bring someone into a system that already works, that's already functional. And I couldn't find anybody that was really mature enough or capable of handling that kind of scenario. So I knew you were going to be the best option. So it's really worked out wonderfully, and I'm really happy for you. I think it's so cool when we we've played in every single event this year. All the IEMs, the dream hacks. Well, I think we missed one dream hack, but you know what I mean. And interviewers now, like the production team, they always ask me for you first before anyone else. It's like, can we get Tacitus on? And I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll ask him.
I mean, as you said, the North American scene is struggling to build good professionals, and I think a lot of that comes with the lack of ability of, for example, just public speaking or working your own image. Again, and the whole esports thing in general, or the scene, I think that has been an issue. And as you said, all these tournament organizers are already asking me to come in, which I mean, it's my pleasure to do so. I love doing interviews. I love doing a lot of speaking, but I think a lot of these players and coaches and whatnot have an underlying issue where they don't market themselves enough. So maybe even the local fans, that cheer on for their teams may not even know who's coaching that team, or they might recognize the name but not the face and voice. And I think that's something that's extremely underrated, is having that next level of connection with your fans. And the whole North American scene for year after year, I think, has struggled with that in every way, shape, and form. And now I think, the segue that you provided with the whole tier 2 scene being underdeveloped, I think a lot of that does come through the lack of coaches and in-game leaders, such as, Alan or MCE prior, playing around that MDL level, advanced level, bringing up the talent. I don't think we have that sort of experience on our tier 2 scene now. And that can only hurt, I think, the future of the scene. So I sure do hope that other in-game leaders do come up and kind of step up to develop talent so that they make that transition into the tier 1 level way easier for their star players or the young, up and coming next one Grims, for example.
I agree, man. I think that there's two things that that brings to mind. It's like, number one, I think in order for people in the tier 2 level and in the tier 2 scene to develop to the professional level, you need to have good leadership, whether that's coming from coaching or from, teammates and, IGLs or team captains, people of that nature, which there's a lack of in the scene right now for sure. But I also think that you need leadership in order to even create new leadership. It's like you need people that are actually in the scene to invest their time into their teams, build their teams over time, and have an impact on people's lives to even develop the next generation of IGL or the next generation of coach, which maybe the reason why we're in the position we're in now is because people haven't invested that time into tier 2. It's really hard to say how we've gotten up here, gotten to this point anyway. I wonder, from your perspective, like, what do you think is missing leadership wise? What do you think can be done to help improve this situation?
I firstly don't really think that the whole Valorant situation helped out, because now you took away some of the in-game leaders that were ready to make that transition into pro. Teams like Riot Squad, teams like Soul Patrol, that were kind of the gatekeepers between MDL and pro, are no longer there to keep you honest with the scene. So I think the scene got flooded with a lot of unstructured talent that now can get away with a lot of things that you wouldn't be able to get away with at an MDL level. So now you have a huge gap between pro and MDL, and a lot of these teams aren't playing that tier 1.5 or that tier 2.5 competition that would initially push them into a zone where they're like, okay, we need structure, we need longevity, we need professionalism. So I think because there is less resistance to get to MDL, I think people essentially are not going to be working as hard to get to that level. And now once they get there and they see that huge gap between their level and tier 1, they're going to be discouraged. So I think we're at a point now where it's going to take a lot of, people like Shixula, myself, MCE, to kind of go out of our own ways and provide help, if possible, to some of these tier 2 teams. It's an initiative I've had within the last month. I kind of offered up on Twitter to help some teams out. I scheduled like 20 teams within a week. And I think that's important, because not only is our gaming ecosystem, if whatever is under us isn't building up, then eventually we're not going to be able to find new talent for our own teams. So in a really selfish way, helping others is helping ourselves. And I think it's important that the people that are up in the scene, or at least quote unquote upward trending in the scene, are helping those who are kind of in a tier below to develop.
Yeah, no, I think so too, man. I mean, and that's a dilemma, right? Because it's obvious that that's the case, but then like the people, there's not enough people, or the people that are in that position to kind of help the tier, the people that need to be, coached or whatever. They either don't want to, or they can't. I don't know. Like, there's just not enough of that happening. So like, how do how do you like? I think one thing that you're doing, for instance, like in this in the holiday period, like you're mentioning, that's helping and that is helpful, is actually you're going out of your way to help teams. And like, maybe the teams that you're helping, maybe you're helping breed the next generation of like person that gives a fuck, you know what I mean? But what else can we do, like other than actually directly talking to players that are developing sort of in the bottom of MDL or maybe in advance and stuff like that? Like, what could possibly be done to promote this growth of leadership and to promote people to become IGLs or to promote people to become coaches and such? Like, how do you even?
Yeah, I think that's definitely difficult because although esports, let's kind of look at Counter-Strike, for example. It's been on like a 20-year cycle ever since 1.6, and that came out in like 1999. And that might seem like a long time, but then you look at, traditional sports that have been around for centuries, they've had way longer to develop their circuits and develop, the whole idea of talent development. So now you look at, soccer, for example, football for my Europeans. You kind of have the U20 divisions within the teams, and then you have the U23s, which is like those players who are under 23, under 20, and then they transition into the professional teams. With Counter-Strike, you kind of don't have that, right? With esports, you're kind of just thrown into the loop, and you might be an amateur and you might be playing against a professional team, and there's just a gap that you have to deal with, both experience-wise. Maybe your team gets to practice 4 hours while they get to practice 8. So there's uneven ground in that regard. So I think something alone that would help is kind of bringing back a more progressive tournament structure that I think has been lacking. Again, I think there's a huge disparity within MDL itself right now. So I think if we had better tournament structure, or at least a more progressive tournament structure with better formatting on the tier 2 scene that better supported its growth, I think it would make the transition easier. And with an easier transition, a more obvious path from amateur to semi-professional to pro, it would make things more sustainable, allow people to maybe quit their jobs so they can get in a full day of practice, so they have the same opportunity that other players are having at the same level that they're in, so that you don't miss out on talent because somebody has to focus on their college education or somebody has to focus on, getting a day job. I think just trying to quote unquote professionalize esports will be a long-term transition. And it's definitely hard because it requires a lot of investment and a lot of money. In North America right now, it's a little bit more like less realistic than Europe because Valorant kind of split the scene. But I think with years to come, we'll see things stabilize again once COVID is over. Once the LANs start coming back, I think CS will kind of, especially in North America, kind of get up from the ground again. And we might start seeing, better development and better organization when it comes to the tier 2 scene. So I think that in itself will help, incentivize more players, which will become the future IGLs. And once maybe those IGLs don't feel comfortable playing anymore, they will transition into the coaching role, or maybe somebody who's a tier 3 IGL, but they're only being held back by their skill, might become a coach for a tier 2 team. And then you might see those people come up that way as well.
Yeah, you might be right. Maybe the only way to really fix this is to continue to invest time and money into this system that's sort of implicit and sort of promotes people based on merit. Like, I think one of the reasons why CS has been so successful anyway is because of this. How did you define it? The system we have that with the different tiers of competition and
kind of an open circuit.
Yeah. Like, the system that you're describing is optimally the way things would be run. Right now, obviously, we're in sort of a situation where it is so easy to move up the levels that it's almost jokingly easy, which is for, I suppose, a few different reasons. But this has actually been a big point of discussion with some of the leaders in the sort of at the tier 2 MDL level. There's actually a chat. I could probably throw you into it, actually. They got thrown together by a few different org owners talking about, how can we improve MDL? We also included people from ESEA in this chat. And we've been talking for the last few weeks about how to improve for this next year. And a lot of it is just people talking about the format of the ESEA ladder, advanced MDL to Pro League and stuff. And one thing that is sort of become apparent is that MDL is not like how it used to be. It's not so exclusive as it used to be. And it's much easier to just pug your way into MDL than ever before. So you see teams with very talented players, of course, they just kind of play through the system and they don't have a coach. They don't really even have a leader on their team. They don't need an IGL. They don't need a lot of structure. They just pug and they end up being in the highest echelon of tier 2 NA, esports. And that sort of reinforces this lack of necessity of leadership or real team structure, right? So the only way, I guess, to fix this problem would be to enforce maybe tighter restrictions on moving up the tiers or something, make it a little bit harder, but still, reward people for merit. I don't know. Maybe that itself will fix the problem.
Yeah, that's definitely tough. I had an ESL, I think, representative reach out to me a few weeks ago, and one of the questions I was asked is, "How do you improve MDL, in your own opinion?" And I said, although it might be counterintuitive, I believe somewhat shrinking the division could be productive because now you throw some of those teams back into the tier three, aka advanced, and you keep the higher tier teams in MDL. And although it wouldn't be as good as MDL was maybe 2 years ago, it would be better than what it is now. You make it into a more exclusive club that somewhat promotes longevity and rewards those tier three advanced teams that actually grind it out. And if a pug team is to make it through advanced, it'll just mean that they're that much more skilled than the teams that are prioritizing structure. So they might still be a competitive entity that can make it through qualifiers. And for example, the rebirths, which they'll be able to be competitive, they'll be able to pull off upsets. And maybe one of those players from a pug team that has the time that his teammates don't moves onto a structured team. And then you're able to take that talent and you're able to kind of bring it up into eventually the pro league. So I think that in itself could be good. Just shrinking MDL, make it more exclusive so that you make it more competitive. And in transition, or in a second thought, you end up throwing better teams back into the tier three. So you also make the tier three more competitive.
Yeah, actually, I feel vindicated in a way because I agree with you, man. Like that's exactly what I said to the ESA guys and the other org owners when we were discussing this in the last couple of weeks. And actually, one of the people that was part of this discussion that I'm referring to is MCE, right? It's a person that you obviously have a lot of respect for. And I said it pretty much exactly what you said just now, that I think the only way really to fix where we're at now is to make it slightly, tougher to get into MDL and to stay at this pro league cusp, make it slightly more exclusive, make it harder to get into. It's the only way to sort of promote people to put in the work to actually become proper teams, in my opinion anyway, right? And I guess in your opinion. But MCE had like a differing opinion. He said like, this has happened before, which it has, to be fair, where they've cut out teams out of Pro League or they've cut teams out of MDL that have earned their spots. And so how do you account for people that have worked for years to actually earn their spots? Like how would you shrink? Like it's a practical problem. How would you shrink MDL to be slightly smaller, maybe advanced to be smaller?
I think it would have to be a 2 to 3 season transition. I don't think you just cut teams right away. I think what you do is you promote less teams and you relegate more teams. So you make it harder to stay within MDL instead of just drawing a knife through the division. And I think that because I could look at MDL right now and I could tell you 5 or 6 teams that probably wouldn't make it back in, or they would have a really rough time making it back in. So I think those teams in the first place should already be in the relegation tournament. And I think for the next 2 to 3 seasons, we should be relegating more teams and we should be moving up. I think the whole idea of advanced being a division, for example, in the tier 3 was for it to be the perfect transition between main and MDL. And ESEA allowed that division to grow up or to grow at such a quick pace that it just became what old main was. And that was a problem because you had a huge disparity between the top of the division and the bottom. And you never want that. You want the skill gap in the division to be as small as possible.
Exactly.
Except for the open division, obviously, because all these teams could sign up. But I think that right now, both MDL and Advanced have the same issue. So I think that you kind of first start by maybe shrinking MDL, and then you reevaluate Advanced. Maybe you do the same treatment. Maybe you relegate more teams and you promote, and you bring all these teams down a tier, or you implement a new division between Advanced and MDL or between main and Advanced. But something has to be done to close down the skill gap within these divisions so that I think talent progression is smoother and more merit-based.
Yeah, absolutely. The skill gap is really important. Like optimally, MDL, for example, because MDL always has promoted to Pro League, in my opinion, MDL should be the tightest race possible with teams that are all right on the cusp of being able to compete in Pro League, right? Like MDL should be a few teams. I don't know, man. We could throw out numbers. I guess it's sort of arbitrary to say numbers, but I could imagine an MDL where there's 10 teams, maybe 8 teams, and all of the teams in there are like legit teams with organizations backing them and coaching structures that are all like good enough to be in Pro League. Maybe a bottom tier, mid tier sort of Pro League team, and they're all fighting for 1 or 2 spots to make it into the Pro League. And hypothetically, if you're building a tiered system, as you said, like every division above open or maybe above the first couple divisions should be really tight. And what we've seen, at least, happen more and more often, leading into the last couple seasons, like you look at MDL, like you're saying, the bottom 5 teams have no business being in a lobby, frankly, with the top few teams, which shouldn't happen. If it was really based on merit and it wasn't just a lot of people being allowed to move up and get their shots, then it would be like a really tight division. And then that leads into the second problem that, we talk about like CS having an issue in North America with investment. Investment comes based on viewership, based on interest. And I think if you have a tighter division with better games that maybe they put a little bit more effort into actually broadcasting these tighter games, you would have way more interest in the division and higher viewership and such, which brings in, of course, more money and resource.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. And I think that is one of the underlying issues with having, nearing a 20-team division is you're running all these best of ones, and now you have these best of ones being broadcasted on smaller Twitch channels, which, to no offense, it's great that, new casters are coming up. I think it's great that we have a development scene for casters as we do for players. But as you said, I mean, just throwing out numbers, I think it could be really healthy to have an 8 to 10 team division, similar, kind of mirroring the Pro League format. And you throw these teams into maybe a group stage where it's all BO3s, and you're able to space out that season because you have fewer teams. You're able to have an entire broadcast, a schedule. You have an actual analyst segment. You might have, these commentators. You have interviews going on. And I think that helps. Again, these players put their face on screen. These players put out their voices. And now these fans that are watching these matches, and again, they might not even care about the teams necessarily. They might just bet because betting is such a huge thing in CS. You're now maybe allowing these bettors to see the face of these players, and maybe they become intrigued by an interview, they become intrigued by a match. So now these teams are actually able to go out there and put themselves out with an opportunity to gain fans, whereas the current scene, the only people watching MDL are people that already care about it. Right. Or maybe somebody who has already bet on a match. You don't randomly find an MDL match because it's, racking 50, 100 views on Twitch. I think with a format like this, we'd be up to the hundreds, if not thousands, or like low thousands in NA if you're able to actually provide it with a better broadcasting schedule. If you're able to shrink down the division to where you're running BO3s and you have an entire streamed layout for these tournaments to happen.
Yeah, I mean, look, the better they make the division, MDL specifically, but you could say this about any division, the better you make the division, the more viewership you're going to get, the more new genuine interest you're going to have. I mean, the only difference between if that didn't matter, then everybody would just watch advanced, like why would you even watch MDL? There's like 30 teams in advanced or whatever. I would just go watch advanced. There's more games. No, like you want to watch because you want to see tight matches against the best teams possible. So I think that is the solution. Now, with that being said, of course, one thing that I think is happening, I can't say for sure because I don't work for ESA, of course, and it's not really my, business to like talk about what's been discussed. But my understanding is that they want to, make significant changes to the structure of MDL going into the next couple seasons, right? And we've already seen them announce that some seasons are not going to lead directly to Pro League for North America, which is really nothing we could do about that. Like this is sort of the result of being a secondary region in the game, I suppose. You can't expect to promote teams from every single region to Pro League every season. So there has already been sort of public announcements made around some of the changes they want to do. But they want to, one thing that's very clear is that best of ones, 4 times a week is not a healthy environment to compete in for many reasons. For players to compete, it's much more difficult to prep for matches. It's much more difficult to get any practice in. But also for broadcasting, because to your point, there are streamers that are being given like the green light to just like, oh yeah, you can cast whatever MDL match you want, and they sort of throw it together last minute, and and bless them, they're great people for doing so. But like if you don't have a structured broadcast schedule, it's really hard for people to even follow the scene at all.
Yeah,
so maybe, yeah.
Again, apologies, but with the whole conversation I was having with the ESL rep and about MDL and about all of this, it was just clear to me that like there's not a clear direction you want to head in because it's such an underlying issue that has been just coming up for year after year after year. There's just not one simple answer, right? Like We've talked about talent development, we've talked about broadcast, we've talked about shrinking the league. So like in about 10 minutes, we've already gone through 3 things that are completely changing the landscape, and it would take time, it would take money, it would take effort, it would take investment. So there's just not one simple solution, and it'll be a transition. I think 2021, I'm very hopeful to what that year will bring, not only because I think our team right now is in a very strange scenario where there's not a team below us with all the rumors of chaos transitioning into Valorant. It's kind of just EG, Liquid, and us. Maybe the Whalers, if they're able to find an organization within the coming weeks.
And probably
or
extra salt
Whalers.
as well, right?
Yeah, and extra salt.
Yeah.
I forgot about those guys. But you kind of just have two teams, maybe three teams at most, competing for that gatekeeping pro league spot. Maybe not even that. Maybe two of us out of these three teams will be in pro league. So what's left for MDL? So the whole gatekeeping idea is kind of dead at this point. So I'm very genuinely curious to kind of see what ESL's and ESEA's response will be to be able to bring back MDL and bring back, that tier 2 of NA Counter-Strike that I think was very interesting at one point with all the Philadelphia tournaments, I think later on it became NCS lands or whatever they called them.
Right.
It was very interesting to just be able to see those tier 2 lands, and they were genuinely very competitive with, finals that with players that you now know as MOTM, Grim, Voltage, all those guys came up through that scene, and I can't wait to see it get back to its feet.
Yeah, no, I'm hopeful as well. And based on the conversations that I think the community's been having over the last couple of months, in light of, chaos being dropped, in light of sort of the struggling of the North American scene. And I'm very hopeful that everyone's going to pull together and make positive changes for sure. And like you said, there's so many angles that we have to attack this from. And there's so many things to consider when trying to improve the scene that it's not just a simple answer. It's going to take time, of course. And much like it's taken a lot of time for the scene to grow. I mean, when the game first came out, when the first Counter-Strike came out, however many years ago, how many years ago is it now? 15, 20 years?
20, yeah.
I mean, there was no scene. There was no scenes back then. You had maybe 10 people show up to like a mall and like rent one of those little mall rooms and like play on these little screens, so it takes time to grow. It takes time to figure out, how to better the structures. And I am hopeful. And with that being said, it's like, how can we, the only thing that I can do, frankly, other than try to support all the teams around us, is focus on what we're doing with Triumph, right? So I've said this to you before, and I've probably talked about this on the podcast before. My goal would be to be an organization that's really involved with everyone else and trying to make the scene better. We've had Diego from Whalers come on the show, of course. And I know that they are re-signing a team very soon for the next year. So they'll be back in our scene with us, which is a positive. I'm trying to bring people together to talk about solutions. So I wonder from your perspective, what do you think we can do as an organization or as a team specifically? Because obviously you work more on the team side. What is your goals, if any, in 2021 to try to set an example for the NACS or try to help NACS grow?
I think heading into 2021, as the time of this podcast coming out, we don't have a 5 right now. We're on the lookout to fill our roster after Ryan has moved on to Valorant. So I think that right now the characteristics that we're even looking for and our top concern with any player that we do go picking up is how much longevity do we see with this roster? And I think that's the example we want to set forth. This year was a very difficult year for us with rosters. I don't think we were able to keep a roster for more than a month and a half, 2 months. Mostly not at our fault. I think we went through 13, 14 changes, only 2 of which we chose, which I think were Asuna and Spongy. Every other change that took place throughout the year was out of our control. And I think 2021 is a year that we want to be able to set forth an example of consistency. We want to build a roster. We want to stick with it. We want to grind through with it. And we want to show people that you do get rewarded for sticking with a roster, practicing with it, and putting in the time. Something that Sheikh Zula kind of brought up to me, I think, early in the year is, you look at all these European teams, all these Russian, Ukrainian teams that all of a sudden are getting good results in the European tournaments. Those guys have a core 3 or 4 that have been together for at least a year. And you don't see that in North America. So I think it's about time that somebody comes forth and sets that example. I think Cloud9 were doing a great job before, they became a European roster, their North American roster that's now extra salt. I think those guys are, putting forth a great example that you stick together and you're able to grow together and you're able to put up good results. And that's kind of what we want to be able to do and mimic in 2021. Put together a roster that will last a long time, and over time, it'll show signs of improvement and development.
Yeah, I think so. It breaks my heart, to be honest, that we haven't been able to keep a roster together, especially because
Oh yeah.
I think from the outside looking in, you might think, the average fan or the average CS, fan, I guess, would might think like, oh, there's problems. Like if they can't keep a team together, they're doing it wrong. It's like, no, we tried to keep a team together. It's like every time, I think we all agree, like you and Alan and I think, as far as we're concerned, we all agree that that's what we should be doing. It's trying to put together a roster, stick together for a long time. And, you won't see like what you're even capable of as a team until like a year in. So, it's just that at every turn we've lost someone to Valorant, or we've obviously been very fortunate to like lose, Mike, for example, to Liquid, which I don't really, it's a loss for us for sure, but I don't look at it in a negative way. It just is what it is. And it's tough in our position, I suppose, to build a consistent team in the scene when, when there isn't this like, the structure in place to reinforce or to reward people for sticking together.
Yeah.
So hopefully in 2021 it will improve. And I know when we find our fifth, when we finally announce Brian onto the team, I know that we're we have nothing but good things to look forward to, and we're gonna have a sick ass year. I know that's true.
Yeah, and I think again, just bringing back the skill gaps and the gaps in between teams, I do think that there should be a tier between, for example, a team like us and a team like Liquid. There should be somewhere in between where you have a middle tier pro team. I think that we were transitioning from MDL into a pro league team, and at that point, we are now a danger. We should be able to play good games against Liquid, but I don't think that we should be a team that, for example, Liquid has to look to bring a player. I think that's a gap in itself. From top pro to bottom pro, I think there's a big gap. So I think that was one of our issues throughout the year, is if any of our players performed or if anybody in this team excelled, it was just a matter of time before they went to the tier 1. It's not like it was a matter of time before a tier 2 team offered them and then they were able to say, you know what, no, my team will be at your level within 3 or 6 months. So since they do get that tier 1 opportunity right away, which, by the way, very, very great. Very happy that Mike is where he is now. But I think that's an underlying issue with the scene, is a lot of these tier 1 teams are now stealing the top head from the tier 3 teams or tier 2.5 teams. And once you do that, then you kind of hit that reset button, and now that team isn't able to develop it. So they're thrown, or to develop rather. So they're thrown back to square zero. And now you don't get what we're talking about, which is, longevity. We don't get to develop our tier 2.5 team into a tier 2 team, into a tier 1.5 team. So you don't get that long story anymore, because as soon as a player excels, he gets that opportunity that he can't say no to.
Yeah, I suppose it's sort of a dual-edged blade, if you will, because for a team at our level, obviously, I pay you $1 million a year, and I normally wouldn't talk about that, but like, obviously we're not an organization that has a ton of money or a ton of investment. We're not a large tier 1 organization. We started in like MDL, you know what I mean? Like this time last year, we were still in MDL. So, we've been growing, but we don't have the resources to provide that tier 1 organizations have, which it creates a dilemma, because if we do our job properly, if you're doing your job properly as a coach, and we're really developing as a team, then like you said, you're always going to end up in that position where the larger teams are going to want to take your players because they become the best players or whatever. And it's a positive thing in some ways, because you're developing the scene by actually, investing time, investing money into upcoming players, which is a positive thing. But then it's also negative, because every time you get poached, you kind of have to go back to square one, like you said. And I don't know if there's really a fix to that. You're saying like maybe create another tier. I don't know if it's ever fixable. And I don't even think it happens that often, actually. Like if I'm thinking back to this year, like how often were teams poached? Like how often did a tier 1 North American team take an NA player?
I don't think
just Grim. I think it was only him this year.
Yeah, I don't think
so. It doesn't happen that often.
Yeah.
Right. So is it even a problem? I don't know. It's hard to say.
I think it's only a problem because there are so little teams. If there were a lot of teams, if you have that, pro league early on in the year where you have Riot Squad, Soul Patrol, us, Chaos, you have all these teams not only fighting for pro league, but at the top of MDL, I don't think it would be a problem, because there are so many options that if one team gets reset, you still have 4 other teams that are competitive in the tier 2. But because we're getting reset, it's now, okay, now Chaos has a huge advantage, right? Because they're not getting reset, but we are. Or Chaos, for example, went through a period where they were making a lot of changes, and we hit some consistency with Rahul and Grim in the middle of the year. So we had a little bit of an edge over them for like 1 or 2 months. So that's the only reason that I see it as an issue, is there are so few teams that if one of them gets reset, they're at a huge disadvantage, and the scene is at a huge disadvantage because now there isn't a competition in the tier 2. It's just one team that's always beating the other, kind of like how Chaos had an edge over us on the last 3 months of this year. So that's the only reason I kind of saw it as unhealthy, is because there are so little teams. If one gets reset, I think the collateral damage is just huge.
Yeah, you might be right. Yeah, maybe the health of the scene is the reason why it seems so bad when you lose a player to a higher tier team. I mean, yeah, I think it's definitely a topic of conversation. You know, I always lean towards, like, obviously again, it just is what it is. It's a double-edged blade, because you obviously want to bring people up and send them on to the next level. That's always been my passion. When I joined Triumph, that's what, you know, I wanted to set out to do. But I quickly learned that, like, oh, you can't just be a farm team. You can't just develop people for the next team, because that always leaves the players that remain on the team in sort of a bad situation where they have to start over. You know, it's just it's so tough, because it's positive, but it's also negative. It's a difficult line to walk anyway. Yeah, I suppose like with the changes that are being proposed, which I suppose maybe we'll talk about privately. I won't talk about them, bring them up on the podcast necessarily. Hopefully we'll see some improvements in the quality of competition at the top of the scene. And then also when a lot of the NA teams come back home from EU, you know, we're going to have slightly better competition back. Maybe this entire year has sort of been like a mulligan, as they say, right? Like, it's hard to even judge the health of the scene when we've been going through a global pandemic for the last, 10 months or whatever, last year.
And on top of a global pandemic, a whole new game is released in that same year. That now you don't have tournaments, or, the LAN tournaments, which are kind of the, I don't know. It's just Counter-Strike. Counter-Strike is supposed to be played on LAN. You have these huge crowds, you have these teams, you have the huge viewership that comes from that. And now you're kind of killing the main thing of Counter-Strike, and you're releasing a new game, and you're putting the entire world on like an economical crisis, which takes away investments from organizations on a time that the scene desperately needs investment. So I think it was kind of a domino effect. Everything happened at once. And to see the fact that we're still able to mobilize the scene, we're still having high level matches, okay, being played in Europe, sure, but they're still being played there. There's still tournaments going on. I think that's a sign that next year, or whatever is to come after COVID, is going to be nothing but great. The player count has been up, so I'm not worried about the state of the game. I'm just worried about the short-term state of the competitive scene. Yeah,
no, I feel the same way. I mean, that's why we're still in CS. We didn't pull out, because I'm pretty certain that everything's going to go back to normal, or at least to some semblance of normalcy, right? Like, I think once LANs are back, like, this entire culture has been built on LANs, right? Like going to majors and stuff. So having that canceled for a year or more now, it just kills everything that we built for like the last 8 years or whatever. So I do think things will go back to normal, and it is good to see people in the scene sort of rising up to the occasion to try to improve things. And the one thing that I always fall back on is, like, as bad as it seems in CS, like, it is worse in most other scenes. We can't even really complain, as much as it feels like kind of shitty, and as much as we've had a tough year, CS is still like a tier 1 esport. It's still like a top 3 esport in the world, right? So I think things are going to be fine, man. And you could argue that Valorant took a lot, maybe took a bigger chunk away from CS this year than COVID did. But I think both games coexist, and I think a lot of the players that went to Valorant will end up coming back as well. So whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm glad the Valorant happened, because, whether or not a lot of the players that go there do come back or stay there, I think it's a great opportunity that they weren't getting in Counter-Strike. As we said, a lot of the tier 2 players that were having to focus on studies or getting a day job are now able to make a living wage by playing Valorant or by streaming Valorant. So I think it's great that a lot of these guys, personal friends of mine, are getting the opportunity that they're getting. I couldn't be happier for them. But again, man, I just can't wait for LANs to come back, and for CS to be back where it should have never left. Yeah, no, it should have never left. And I'm very excited for LANs to be back. Trust me. Like, I can't believe it's been like a year since going to an event. It's so crazy. One thing that should be said to sort of
give a counterpoint to my own point. Is, I don't think that people even going to Valorant is a problem. When I say that the game coexists, I mean it, or it can coexist, I mean it, sorry. And one thing that people aren't really accounting for is that whenever people leave the scene, whether it's for Valorant or any other AAA title that has come out in the past over the course of Counter-Strike's life, it just creates a void, and the void always will be filled. And this sort of leans into the conversation that we began with, where like, okay, when players leave, that means more players have to be moved up, right, from a lower division or from a lower level of competition. And it's an inevitability that the holes will be filled by new talent. And really the struggle is on our shoulders, the people that remain in the scene and the tier 1 and tier 2 teams that are not leaving for Valorant. There's a responsibility to us to help bring up the new people and lead them alongside us like properly, which is hard to do if there's not a lot of good leadership, not a lot of good coaches, not a lot of good IGLs in the scene. But hopefully everything that we touched on in regards to improving competition maybe will help smoothen that transition.
Yeah, we can be hopeful. I mean, again, as we said, I think it all starts from the top to the bottom. So it'll start through the tournament organizers, which with better structure will bring more longevity to these rosters. More longevity to these rosters mean that further IGLs are going to be developing because people are going to take up on that role. Maybe, players that aren't even natural born leaders, they will adapt into that role. And once you have those IGLs and those guys are going to age, then they're going to become coaches. And then those coaches are now going to coach the next generation of IGLs. I just hope that the scene is able to live long enough to see that, and I think it will, because as we mentioned early on in the podcast, the traditional sports, they've been around for centuries, decades at the least. Counter-Strike has been alive for 20 years and CSGO only for 8, so it's not even a decade. Right. And for us to see the development that we've seen, the game looks completely different than it did 5 years ago. It's literally been a boom, and I think we're trying to figure it out as we go, but slowly but surely, I think we were hitting a point prior to COVID where we were seeing the first generation of in-game leaders, Gabi, Zeus, those guys kind of going into retirement, and maybe they were going to coach, but then we lost Gabi to Valorant. I don't know what Zeus is up to right now. But I think it's important that once the cycle for some of these players is over, they take over that role to kind of look forward and look back and help the next generation. I think Fallen did a great job with that in the Brazilian scene. As he was playing, he kind of built an entire platform of videos where he was teaching people about the game. And I think that built the next generation of Brazilian IGLs that we're starting to see now when we start to see people like Art come up. And I think Brazil actually has a way healthier ecosystem than North America does right now. A lot of that, I think, given by Fallen's initiative. So I think it would be great if we were able to see some sort of North American initiative where maybe an MCE or somebody along those lines are able to take on a role officially or unofficially to kind of, broaden the knowledge of the scene and help these next IGLs come up.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful perspective, man. And yeah, I agree with you. And I think that the biggest problem is that we lost a lot of like legit leaders to Valorant. Yeah. I mean, that's a huge hit. Like losing big coaches to Valorant is a huge hit to the scene. Like maybe more so than losing players. Like for, no disrespect to players, but when you have somebody that's, played CS through 3 iterations of the game for 10 years, who's like led, championship level teams, go to Valorant, that's a huge loss because that person is no longer investing their knowledge into the CS scene. So it's a huge, unlucky, I suppose. You bring up the Brazilian scene, and I'm interested actually, since we have you here and you are a Brazilian yourself, as much as you are an American, of course, you have knowledge of the Brazilian scene that I think a lot of fans of North American CS don't have. So I wonder, like, how is the Brazilian scene doing? Because it's hard for me as a North American, CS fan to really follow Brazilian CS because I don't speak Portuguese and I don't even know like the media outlets to really go. How is Brazilian CS? You see like so many great teams come out of Brazil. Obviously you have the historic legendary MIBR family, but you also have Fury, who's become a top team this last year too. And you see other teams like Team One, teams like teams like Fear or whatever, like you have all these teams come up and play in North America. Is there just like a million really good teams in Brazil that aren't getting their shot to shine, or what?
Well, firstly, there are still a lot of good teams. There's a tournament going on right now called the Gamers Club Masters, which is kind of, all the best Brazilian teams that haven't moved out yet are playing in that tournament. And I could easily see two, three, four more teams that could be competing abroad, which is just scary to think about. But the Brazilian scene right now is in a little bit of a weird structure because, as you brought up, the legendary MIBR core of Fallen, Fur, and Taco, it seemed like those guys have now split after the whatever happened with MIBR, in the last, quarter of the year. So between rumors and whatnot, going into next year should be really exciting for the Brazilian scene because we're going to have at least 4 to 5 teams competing at the highest level in the world, which is obviously abroad, either in Europe or North America. And obviously Furia has taken the lead a little bit right now in terms of who's the best Brazilian team, but MIBR has been able to do wonders with the recent roster that they put together. Nobody really knows if that's the roster they're going to go with or if it's going to still undergo 1 or 2 changes prior to them officially saying this is what we're going to ride out with. The whole idea of 6-man rosters might be implemented in that team. So who knows, what will come out of that. But what's really exciting for the Brazilian scene is that unlike the NA scene, they kind of have a hierarchy on, progressive talent development. You can go from a tier 2 Brazilian team to a tier 1 Brazilian team that's only playing within Brazil. And then you go from that tier 1 Brazilian team that's only playing within Brazil to like the 5th best Brazilian team that's playing outside of Brazil. And from that 5th best Brazilian team that's playing outside of Brazil, you get poached to maybe the best or the second best. Kind of the transition that we saw with TRK, who's now in MIBR. For the longest time, he played on Team 1, and Team 1 became the best team within Brazil. Then they moved out. They became one of the better Brazilian teams outside of Brazil. Didn't find as much success as Furia when they were developing, but TRK then became, the star of that team, and then he got brought on to MIBR. So I think within Brazil right now, there is a more defined path for talent to development, and I think that encourages growth. I think there are more IGLs, although I think there are worrying signs that a lot of them are aging. For example, Team 1 had to transition Maluki, who'd never been an IGL, I believe, into the IGL role just because he's the most experienced in the team. So just from that, he had to become the IGL. KNG had to pick it up on MIBR. But it's really cool to see that these players that weren't IGLs before are having a quote-unquote easy time picking up the role because they've all been influenced by one way or another by great IGLs in the past. So because they've played with great leaders in the past, they have an easy time transitioning into the role because, as we've spoken before, it's really important that you have references to look onto on your own scene. And within Brazil, you have the legendary 1.6 players that some people outside of the scene might have not heard of, but Bit and Knack have, more famous names like Fallen, for example. So just because there are so many IGLs within the scene that have left their influence on a lot of these players, I think these players have a much easier time transitioning into the in-game leading role than a North American player has, for example.
Yeah. Do you think that the current structure, the way it is, where teams in Brazil basically have to play locally in their own region before getting moved up to, if they become the best team, they actually move to like playing either in the North American scene, or they get picked up for teams that are already in the North American scene? Do you think that this is healthy? Do you think that there's a better way for the scene to work, or do you think that it's become so vital to the way that the scene works that it's actually effective?
I think it's very effective, and I think it's very unique. It's not so geographically locked like Australia to where those teams are only get one shot a year. And that's how the Brazilian scene was back in 2013, 2014. These teams had to play an entire year to send one team for one tournament out. And finally, maybe in 2015, when that Fallen core came out as Skeed Stars and they became LG, was when they were able to play ESL Pro League. They were able to take that gamble and move out, leave their families behind, and kind of pave the way to say, okay, we can now have a national scene and we can have the best teams from our local scene come out and play internationally. And I think it's exceptionally, healthy because you have the progression of difficulty and resistance. If you're a team coming up in Brazil, you first have to get through the local teams. So then you go into the North American team or the North America region, and you play not only the North American teams, but you play the Brazilian top dogs. So you have to prove yourself one step at a time, and you're never really taking a big jump. You're never taking a leap that's too great for what you can sustain. Whereas in North America, sometimes you see in a qualifier an intermediate team just beats 3 main teams. Now they're going to play Triumph, and it's just a huge gap for them because they go from playing semi-professional teams that are only practicing 3 hours a day to now you play a full-fledged team that practices 8-9 hours a day, and maybe you don't have as realistic of a chance as you would if you were if you had a more progressive take, step by step, increasing the difficulty one step at a time. And that's what I think Brazil has going on for them right now. You can transition from being an amateur team to playing the top local team to then playing the top Brazilian team once you get an opportunity to maybe qualify for ESL Pro League. So it's never a step that's too big, too unrealistic. And I think those teams, they improve that way. They improve one step at a time, practicing always just one difficulty above where their level is at a time, never jumping too many levels at once.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, it seems to be effective. I think it's so interesting to me just because it is very unique. It's like the Brazilian scene is unlike any other scene. And I never thought about that point of like, there are regions like in Australia, for instance, where like if you have to be the number one team to get a shot, and even then it's like rare that you get the shot. Like it's really hard to get that shot. Like you might have to wait many seasons to get the shot to get in Pro League or whatever, So it is different that, it's become normal for Brazilian teams to come play in North American competition, and they excel. And I think it's like a more difficult path, and the more difficult path is the reason why, one of the many reasons why Brazilian CS is so loved. Yeah. Like I believe that it does actually make fans love the teams more because they go through more hardship and they've proved themselves. They're not, the teams like Team One and Furia that come to NA and play well, like it's not a fluke. They definitely earned it, and it makes you kind of adore them as a fan, right? Just from a spectator's point of view.
The whole idea that like they're not playing a Counter-Strike match and then they're leaving their bedroom, going to their living room and talking to their parents. No, their parents are like across the world. They're playing a Counter-Strike match next to the people that they play with in a house, in a country that they might not even speak the language of, that they don't know the culture of. And, they're here on maybe work visas. So it's not like a permanent thing for them. They were risking it. They're kind of taking a gamble, and that's the only thing they have going. So I think the for them, it's like losing isn't an option. Their only option is to come out here and grind it out because it's their passion. It's what they want to do for a living. And so they kind of give it their all. And maybe just being out of your comfort zone to that degree, to that extent, is what's able to push those teams maybe even above their 100%. Sometimes you see those players giving their 110% and they overperform. So I think that's what the magic is behind the Brazilian scene. It's not only, the fact that there's a great influence within the scene, and for example, what Fallen has left impact-wise, but just the amount of sheer passion coming out of these players and the risks that they're taking within their lives to just move across the world to play the game. I think that definitely helps them move forward and be more competitive than maybe they have any business being sometimes. It's just that sheer passion that pushes them one step further.
Yeah, it's beautiful, man. It is beautiful. It's like what competition's all about, Yeah. I mean, it's unfortunate. Like it is, there's something to be said. Like maybe, well, we all know Valve doesn't really get involved at all with anything that the CS scene is doing. But like part of us, I think, we can acknowledge that we should make it an easier path to pro for Brazilian CS. But as it is, it's much tougher. But it's beautiful in that way because it's like, if you're making it as a Brazilian player or as a Brazilian team, it's because you really went through the ringer, dude. And it makes the victory that much sweeter. Not only for the teams, but for the fans, so it's incredible, man. I know like in NA, the Brazilian scene sort of gets panned a lot because of like the miscommunications on social media. And obviously like, whenever an NA team beats like a Brazilian team or something, there's like a lot of hate coming to them, in Portuguese on Twitter or something. And I think there's like a big miscommunication between the two regions, but at the end of the day, man, the Brazilian scene is incredible, man. And that's why I want to ask you about that, because I find it fascinating that it's so different and it produces such great talent,
Yeah, and I always joke that we were the lucky ones because we played MIBR and we had an exceptionally competitive game against them. And usually you'd catch the short end of the stick reaction-wise. But no, all the Brazilians kind of fell in love with our team and they started rooting for us. Even when we play teams like Team One, you have Brazilians that are no longer rooting for Team One, they're rooting for us. And I mean, obviously, it plays an impact that I think we had a good communication with them. It helps that we have a Brazilian coach and me. And I've been able to kind of pave the way to kind of bridge the gap between our players and the Brazilian fans. But I still think it's awesome that I think we're one of the first, non-Brazilian teams that these Brazilian fans are looking at and being like, yeah, let's go Triumph. We're going to root for you guys. We're going to cheer you guys on. And if there's no Brazilian team, then you guys are Brazil in that tournament. And I think that's really awesome.
I love it when fans say we are Brazil. It's my favorite thing. I'm not going to lie. It's actually maybe my favorite interaction about all of our teams. I think it's so funny. Like, and I don't know how we ended up here, but it's just like, there's a mutual respect between our team, between our organization and Brazil. And then there's a mutual respect from Brazil and Brazilian fans for our team, because as you said, like, they have to have someone to root for. Maybe if there's no Brazilian team in the tournament, they obviously have respect for you. They have respect for our respect for them. Like it's just a beautiful thing. And I'm very thankful for all of our Brazilian fans. All right. So look, man, that hour flew by. And I'm really glad that you joined me for this episode, dude. It's a blast talking to you. And I know I get to talk to you pretty often anyway, but I think that your perspective on the scene is really, really valuable, especially in these times when we're trying to improve the scene. So I really appreciate this episode, man. And, before we go, I wanted to give you an opportunity. If you have any last thing you want to say or promote or talk about that you'd like to, leave us with, I'll give you that opportunity to do so, man.
Well, yeah, I guess we, have to thank our sponsors like HyperX, Respawn, Advanced GG, obviously. But first and foremost, thanks for the invitation. I do love talking about the game. I think over time, I kind of was losing my passion for Counter-Strike, and I think this year I re-encountered it. I realized that I didn't just love the competitive aspect. I generally love the game, and that's why I love talking about it so much. I love just expressing my opinion, although it might be valid or invalid in certain points. I just hope that whatever is good from what I say is taken and implemented, because I genuinely care about the state of the game. I do have to thank Triumph for the amazing year that they've been able to provide me with. It's definitely, again, I kind of feel selfish saying this, but for some people, it might have been the worst year of their lives because of COVID and whatnot, people losing their jobs. But for me, it was the most amazing year I could have dreamt of, professionally speaking. I'm able to do what I love, which is be involved with Counter-Strike. I'm able to work with people that I consider as friends. It's a great environment. I get out of bed every day excited to, just get on my computer, watch demos, study other teams, study my own team, and look for how we can improve going into next year.
Yeah, and by the way, people that are watching or listening to this podcast, there is not a gun to his head. He said it's not. You might have to move the camera left and right, make sure there's nobody else in the camera
right now.
Yeah, Scott's off camera. No, yeah, it's beautiful, man. It's been a blast this year, and I'm very looking forward to 2021. I know we're gonna kill it, dude. So I'm excited to move past the holiday. Also, for the listeners, before we close out the show, if you made it this far in the show, I want to let you guys know that next week we're not going to do an episode. It is the holidays. We have a lot of people traveling, including myself, for Christmas over the weekend. So we're going to come back in the new year with the next episode. So for now, this is all you get. But Marcos, thank you for coming on, man. I really do appreciate it. I know you have a tournament to play this weekend, so I will let you get to that. But thanks, man. It's good to talk to you.
All righty. Thank you.